Morning, everyone. I'm glad everybody made it. What a icy morning it is out there, and I hear we had some casualties. What a dedicated committee. Getting here even when they have accidents on the way. But anyway, is everybody okay now? Well, we have a very busy morning. And we're honored today to have our minister here, Minister Champagne, Minister for Trade. Thank you for your good work on, we didn't know you were a doctor.
Well, I'm no doctor, but I'm just a good Samaritan, I guess.
Man of many talents. Anyway, good job. Well, sir, welcome. And you've been here before, and you know the protocol, and you got the floor, sir.
Well, thank you very much, Chair and committee members. So let me apologize for being late. And Chair, I'm quite happy to extend the meeting by whatever time I was late, because obviously the safety and health and safety of our members is paramount. So certainly wanted to make sure we could all be here this morning. I also want to thank the committee. Yesterday I had a chance to read the report again that was produced on the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the year of work that you all did across Canada. I just refreshed my memory yesterday by reading it again, and I just want to say thank you, because you spent a good part of a year crisscrossing the country, hearing from Canadians on the issues. So I just want to say thank you. If you allow me, Chair, I'll do brief remarks as it's customary, and then obviously engaging with members on topics. Je vous remercie évidemment de me donner.
I'd like to thank you for this opportunity to offer the committee an update with regard to the trade initiatives that our government is launching in Asia, including the new CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, as well as our potential trade agreement with China. Recently, I was able to speak to the Standing Senate Committee of Foreign Affairs about these same topics. The increase in the rate of trade between Canada and the booming markets of the Asia-Pacific area is a priority for the Canadian government. I am very happy to be here to discuss our government's progress in this regard. Firstly, I would like to introduce the representatives of the department who are here today, who have worked very hard on the accomplishments we have recently done. Tim Sargent, Deputy Minister for International Trade on my left, the Assistant Deputy Minister for Trade Policy and Negotiations, as well as Chief Negotiator for the CPTPP, Bruce Christie, and the Director of the Trade Policy and Negotiations Division, Asia, and Deputy Chief Negotiator for the CPTPP, Kendall Hembroth, here on my left as well. Canada wishes to sign agreements that will promote middle-class interests and create opportunities for exporters, as well as well-paid middle-class jobs. That is our priority, and we wish to negotiate in the best interests of all Canadians.
Raising the standards of living for our middle class depends on our robust international trade, and that means support for the rules-based order and the institutions that underpin it, as well as more high-quality trade and investment agreements between Canada and its partners around the world. Canada has shown that it's ready to stand up for Canadians and defend our interests in order to get the best deal for Canada, because these deals have a lasting impact on our nation. Moreover, a progressive trade agenda opens more doors, raises standards, and positions the middle class for success. We are the most diverse and open country on earth. A progressive trade agenda not only reflects our economic values, but our social values as well. When global investors look to position their future investments in capital, they want stability and predictability. I'll put it to you, members, that's Canada. When the talent pool of tomorrow's economy seeks a place to build their business, they want diversity, openness, and all the creativity that comes from a society that embraces and encourages both. That's Canada. The progressive trade agenda is not only the right thing to do, but it's the smart thing to do economically. Trade is a march to the top, not a race to the bottom. Canada is leading that charge, and while that takes more effort, it will pay economic dividends for the middle class for decades to come. C'est pourquoi, vous vous en rappellerez, le Canada et la Chine.
That's why, as you know, Canada and China announced the beginning of exploratory talks for a potential agreement. This was announced in September 2016. To date, the two countries have had 4 rounds of talks. Canada and China are continuing to dialogue in order to evaluate the scope of this potential trade agreement. In parallel with these exploratory talks, the Government of Canada held public consultations between March and June 2017 on the possibility of an agreement with China. More than 600 stakeholders and partners expressed their point of view. Generally, Canadians told us that they believe that such an agreement would hold both advantages and challenges. Businesses feel that an agreement could improve access to the Chinese market, and they identified some issues that they would like to address during the process, including non-tariff barriers in areas such as IP. Some civil society groups, as well as unions and individuals, mentioned the importance of discussing issues like labor and the environment during our talks with China. Respecting our government's commitment to transparency, a public report summing up these points of view was published in November 2017, which is a first for trade consultations in Canada.
Visit to China last December, Canada and China committed to continuing exploratory talks to ensure potential negotiations are based on a shared understanding of the issues to be negotiated, as well as the scope and level of ambition of those negotiations. Canada is committed to taking the time required to make sure any future decision on whether to launch free trade negotiations with China is in the best interest of all Canadians. Should we pursue deeper economic engagement with China, we will do so by creating more opportunities for the middle class. Progressive trade means that trade benefits all Canadians, puts people first, and reflects our standards and, very importantly, our values. We remain committed to building a stronger and more comprehensive relationship between Canada and China based on a regular and frank dialogue, but we'll take the time needed to ensure that we get this right. I now wish to talk to you about the recently concluded Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, otherwise known as the CPTPP. On January 23rd, Canada and 10 other countries concluded negotiations for a new agreement in Tokyo, in Japan. Asia-Pacific is an important region and a priority market for Canada, and Canada is pleased to be part of the CPTPP, a trading bloc that represents 495 million people with a combined GDP of almost 14 trillion. Canada has been intensely engaged in the new CPTPP from the first meetings of officials in May 2017 to proposing suspensions and changes to secure better terms for Canadians. Our positions in the CPTPP have been underpinned by extensive consultations with Canadians. The Government of Canada conducted 2 sets of comprehensive public consultations with Canadians to seek their views on the original TPP consultation initiated on November 2015 and a potential new agreement among the remaining TPP members without the United States of America. Collectively, since November 2015, the government has held approximately 250 interactions with over 650 stakeholders, including business and non-business associations, civil society organizations, think tanks, academics, indigenous groups, youth, and the general public. Le PTPGP incorpore par
The CPTPP incorporates by reference the provisions of the initial TPP and will suspend 22 provisions as soon as it enters into force. These suspensions cover a wide range of areas, including important provisions on IP, which were concerning Canadian stakeholders. Canada is also maintaining the possibility of adopting cultural provisions, including in the digital world, and has signed important bilateral agreements with Malaysia, Japan, and Australia in the auto sector. Moreover, the CPTPP is contributing to Canada's progressive trade agenda in various areas, including labor, the environment, SMEs, transparency, and the fight against corruption. Moreover, this agreement is the first free trade agreement signed in Canada with binding chapters on labor and the environment,
where the parties affirmed their commitment to promote and strengthen a trade environment that seeks to improve welfare, reduce poverty, and raise living standards, as well as focusing on women and economic growth, highlighting the importance that women should be able to fully access the benefits and the opportunities created by this agreement. Once the CPTPP enters into force, it will become one of the largest free trade agreements in the world. In the area of goods, market access gains under the CPTPP will be significant, especially in CPTPP countries with Canada does not currently have free trade agreements and where tariffs remain high. Gains from the CPTPP will benefit a wide range of sectors across all provinces in Canada, including financial services, fish and seafood, forestry, agriculture and agri-food, and metals and minerals. Our exporters and investors will benefit from more transparent and predictable market access, and potential gains from the CPTPP will increase as new countries seek to join the agreement. This agreement will not only benefit Canada economically and commercially, but also strategically, allowing Canada to diversify our trade and providing a platform to influence future trade rules in the very important Asia-Pacific region. Mr. Chair, I'll now be happy to take questions from committee members.
Well, thank you, Minister. And if the committee sees their agenda, this is our big anniversary. We hit 100 today, 100 meetings since the 42th Parliament. So congratulations. I think we almost got 10 studies under our belt, so good work all. Before I move over to the other MPs, Minister, before the meeting I had a chat with the Canadian Cattlemen Association, and they're very supportive, of course, of our trade negotiations and agreements, and they're also very complimentary on the previous government, the work that they did. Their question to me is through you is once things are signed, it's very important that we move quickly or aggressively, I guess, because there's out of the other 11 members, there's a lot of cattle producers, beef producers, and their sense is the quicker we can get our foot in the door and stake our claim, it's important. So I don't know if you have any quick comments on that before I move over to the other MPs.
Well, Mr. Chair, thank you, and I would like to thank the Cattlemen Association of Canada. They've been with me in pretty much every city that I've been negotiating trade agreements, so it's always a pleasure to have them with us. They're quite right, Mr. Chair. One of the benefits of what Canada has achieved is the first mover advantage. We know that in these markets, in the configuration of the CPTPP, Canada will have first mover advantage in one of the very important markets for them, which is Japan. And therefore, we are going to proceed. As you know, the signature date has been set for the 8th of March in Chile, in Santiago. And following that, we will proceed, obviously, with ratification. The ratification process under the CPTPP requires 6 countries to ratify and 50% of those which are signatory to the agreement. So we understand the importance for the Cattlemen Association of Canada, and we will proceed diligently with your help, the help of the House of Commons and obviously the Senate.
Thank you, sir. And we're going to move right to the MPs here, the rest, and Conservatives are up first, 5 minutes. Mr. Allison, you got the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Minister, for being here today, and to our officials, thanks for the great work you guys do. I know that we're very proud of how you represent us on the world stage. Very quick question. So many questions, so little time. So you're going to give us, some of us, a technical briefing today at TPP. So my question is, when is the full text going to be available for the public?
You know, as soon as possible would be the answer. You know these agreements very well in the process. There needs to be legal scrub and translation. So we are proceeding diligently. But our aim, as we said before, you know, transparency and openness has been key. And thanks to the work of this committee as well, when you consulted Canadian, we'll make it available as soon as possible.
Okay, that's very definitive. Okay, thank you. Chinese steel. The committee did a study here before I arrived here and made some recommendations. Can you tell us any of the tangible steps your government's doing to deal with the whole issue of Chinese steel dumping? Obviously, there's an irritant with the U.S. as well. Just would quickly want to know what kind of things you guys are up to.
Well, it is a very important situation. Obviously, as you know, Canada is cooperating with other countries in the world through the WTO, and we will continue to cooperate. I think part of the solution is certainly on the international arena with the WTO, making sure that Canada joins its voice with other countries. And I would also say that being part also of these agreements, which provides, if you allow me to just step back a minute, when we, you know, when the U.S. decided to withdraw from that about 12 months ago, the trade minister met in Lima, Peru about 10 months ago. And part of the question, just to get to your point, was where do we go from there? Is everyone going back home, or do we all believe collectively that having a rule-based system where we would have mechanism to enforce fair trade rules in the region would be beneficial to our countries? And we came to that conclusion. So to your answer, we will continue at the WTO, but I also think that agreements like CPTPP is providing a framework where Canada can have influence as the second largest economy in the trading bloc currently.
Okay, thanks. My question now about China. I mean, you talk about progressive deals. Obviously, I won't get into what's different with this CPTPP versus the one we did. I may leave that to some of my colleagues. So we talk about China, clearly human rights issues. Clearly, I think a country that is challenged with any kind of progressive rules or looking at things like that. They manipulate their currency. They subsidize their energy, their industries. They dump steel. You know, John Chang, a winery owner, which I know that your government's been seized with, from my area, is presently being held against as well and on trumped up charges. So my question is, you know, you start to talk about a deal with China, and I think we understand that it's important. Our ag markets want access. These are important things. What is the government prepared to do on the other side to make sure that SOEs, to make sure that reviews are done on a number of different things? Because, you know, trade is one thing, but how are we going to protect Canadian businesses on the other side when clearly this country is not prepared to follow any rules, certainly not any rules that we would normally play by in North America as a free society?
Well, thank you. This is a very important question, and I'm quite happy. And I would say it's doing what we're doing now. As you may have seen last time in Beijing, we're not rushing into anything. We've been pretty clear that we would engage with China with our eyes wide open on our timetable and according to our principles. And you've seen that. We have said that we will continue to have exploratory discussion as to whether or not we should have a trade agreement with China. And I would say to you, the items you mentioned are very important to Canadians. I think Canadians expect us to open market, but not at the expense of the environment, not at the expense of labor rights, not at the expense of making sure that women and men would have equal chance in trade. So that's why when we come to these negotiations, and I think you've seen us, if you look at the CPTPP, I was saying it in my opening remarks, this is the first trade agreement where we have an enforceable labor and environment chapter. We have a chapter also on governance. We have a chapter on small and medium-sized businesses. So I guess my point to you is we're not rushing into anything. We want to make sure that we have the right basis. And that's why we took more than a year. As you know, we had 4 rounds of officials with our Chinese counterpart to discuss about the content of what should be discussed. And again, when we were in China recently, and still now, engaging, but on the basis, like I said, of eyes wide open, our timetable, and clear principles as far as the Canadian side is concerned.
Thanks.
And thank you for your work on the files and all your colleagues. You've been very helpful.
Thank you, gentlemen. We're going to move over to Madame Lapointe for Liberals for 5 minutes. Go ahead.
Bienvenue, Monsieur le Ministre. Bienvenue aux
Welcome, Minister. I'd like to welcome the officials. I'm very happy to see you all today. I'd like to pass on a message to my constituents. You know, my riding is north of Montreal. There's a lot of aerospace companies, agri-foods processing companies, and automobile, as well as maple and apple products. So for my constituents, with these agreements, like with the CPTPP, what are the opportunities for people in areas like that and SMEs? Thank you for the question. Indeed, it was a pleasure to visit your riding. I hope to be able to go back. You mentioned aerospace and agriculture. These are sectors that will benefit. In an agreement like the CPTPP, we're always trying to reduce tariff barriers. Now, some countries that will sign this agreement currently have major tariff barriers that reduce the potential for our exports. You mentioned maple syrup, or seafood, or pork, or beef products. These are significant markets, and an agreement like this one will enable us to reduce these tariff barriers to facilitate market access. The next step, and I'd like to say this to the chair of the committee as well, will be to work together to promote these agreements. Because, as I always say, the definition of success is not just to sign an agreement, but to ensure that these agreements turn into opportunities for Canadians, that they turn into actual jobs and economic prosperity. So, lowering tariffs, some of the previously highest tariffs in the world, will allow us to export more. And I think each of us, each MP in each of our ridings, needs to promote this agreement to ensure that SMEs can benefit from this and from the regulatory framework we have to facilitate exports. Thank you. I have 2 more questions, very quickly. Firstly, when it comes to the cultural exemption, well, you said, I would like to hear you a bit more, you speak a bit more on this, because as you know, my riding, it's an area where this is very important issue. So can you tell us more about the cultural exemption? Well, yes, indeed. It's very important. The members of the committee will know that we've stayed strong throughout this process in order to ensure that we can strengthen the existing agreement and some sectors in particular. You mentioned culture. Well, we succeeded in obtaining for the Canadian cultural industry protections which will allow us to invest and protect the industry and promote our culture. This is an extremely critical issue, and I'd also like to thank the Prime Minister, because I think Canadians realize that we have fought all down the line to ensure that we're protecting this aspect of the negotiations, which is very important. Same thing for the automobile sector, where we've made substantial gains in market access in Japan and in Malaysia and Australia as well. And to return to my colleague's question, Canadians understand that we want to sign this agreement and get it done, but we don't want just any old agreement. We want a good agreement. We want to do this right, and so we need to know when it's not the right time to go ahead with the agreement. We need to continue to negotiate. And that's what we've been doing in the previous rounds and what we've done in the last few weeks when the Prime Minister announced we would sign the agreement. Thank you. That's very important for my constituents. Now, you mentioned Malaysia. I imagine that you know that the committee is going to visit Asia next week, and we are going to visit Malaysia as well as Thailand and Singapore. what would you suggest that we study specifically? Well, I'm very happy that the committee is traveling in the Asia-Pacific region. After all, it's a critical area. 14% of the global economy in the very area of the agreement. And we've also launched negotiations with the ASEAN countries, China, India, which I recently visited. I think the most important thing to study is non-tariff barriers, in my humble opinion. We've seen that tariffs are plummeting around the world, but we need to keep an eye on non-tariff barriers because what matters ultimately for Canadian entrepreneurs is market access. And I would say that recently, in our department, we have launched an initiative which is almost like a SWAT team to take care of non-tariff barriers. So when Canadians come up against these non-tariff barriers, they can go onto a website, notify the department. We have people who will respond within 24 hours, respond to the request, and then we will go look at the trade agreements and see what are the applicable provisions. And then we get back to the person who's run up against these barriers, and we're going to try to eliminate the non-tariff barriers under the agreements, but we'll also gather the information we need to negotiate in future agreements so that we're aware of these non-tariff barriers. And this is drawing from best practices in the world. Because ultimately, what I was checking with the Deputy Minister is that we need to reduce these non-tariff barriers and offer Canadian entrepreneurs to be more informed and to inform us so that we can act.
Over to NDP now. Ms. Ramsey, you got the floor. 5 minutes.
Good morning, Minister. I'm pleased to hear that you have read our report. That means then that you're aware of the information that we received, that over 50,000 Canadians wrote to us, that over 90% of them opposed the TPP during our study. We had a Tufts University study that said 58,000 jobs would be lost in Canada under the TPP. And so really there were some warnings to us, and certainly from the government's own financial impact analysis, economic impact, showed 0.2% growth, which by all accounts is quite negligible by 2036. And I think that in signing the TPP, you've successfully pitted Canadians against one another across this country, and that's a shame. And I will tell you that we recognize that there are pieces of the TPP that are important to certain sectors, but as you know, I'm an auto worker. I represent a region in southwestern Ontario that was blindsided by the signing of the TPP. Auto workers and auto companies like the Canadian vehicle manufacturers, the automotive parts manufacturers, Unifor, are united in opposition of the TPP. Now, we're at a disadvantage, of course, because none of us have seen the TPP in its current iteration except for those present here. And there have been, distinct calls from those groups to be able to be privy to that information. But I can tell you that people in southwestern Ontario are in shock, and they're very nervous about their jobs. So I wonder if you can please speak to what you see in the CPTPP that will counter the losses of jobs, and in particular to auto.
And I'm very happy for your question because, the day after that we announced that we'd be signing, I was in Oakville, Burlington, and Hamilton, having roundtables with people.
You didn't quite make it down to Windsor. I know that you couldn't make it.
Well, it's because of the time schedule.
Of course, would welcome you at any point.
But,
I know you couldn't make it.
I'm more than happy, and you'd say, I have had the discussion with CVMA. I had discussion with yesterday I was with probably 10 to 15 people of the auto sector on a conference call. We've been engaging with each other, understanding. One of the things that you will see in your report, and
with all due respect, though, Minister, around the TPP, I don't believe that's the case. I believe that you spent time with them over the NAFTA round, and that many of them said that, there was no inkling that this was coming. They were blindsided by it.
Mr. Chair, with respect, I would just say, if you talk to the CEOs of the various companies, I was with some just recently. I was on the phone with many of them over the course of the discussion. What you would find, and I'm happy to say, one of the things, and you will recall in the letter from CVMA, was about market access. And yesterday we spent, 51 minutes talking about market access in some of these markets. I understand the concerns, and the auto sector is an important one. We want to invest in the auto sector, and one of the things that they were asking us is market access. And Chair, if you allow me, one of the things we've achieved today is the greatest market access to the Japanese market. What we've achieved is to remove the non-tariff trade barrier with respect to safety in Japan. This is more than we ever got in the history of the auto sector in Canada. We not only got that, but we got in the side letter, which is going to be made available as soon as possible.
Which we'll see, I think, at 1 o'clock. I
But
think
we
we'll
will,
see part of that technical
we
briefing.
will have also a dispute settlement process, which is distinct for that, with
I'm
snapback
sorry,
provision.
I don't want to cut you off, but I really have a limited amount of time. So I do need to move on because I really would like to ask about the dairy as well. With the market being open with supply management, there was a promise of $4.3 billion from the Conservative government, which was part of the original negotiations. Will you be offering that compensation package to dairy as well?
Let me just finish on the auto sector, if you allow me, Chair, just to say that I think what we've achieved is the greatest market access for the auto sector in Canada, and one of the things that even the unions would tell you is that we stood up for them and we got a better deal. Now, with
Find out at 1
respect
o'clock.
to with respect to dairy,
Just hold it, if I may, Minister. I know, Ms. Ramsey, we're just going to hold the clock for a second there. I know you want to get a whole bunch of questions in. Maybe if you ask all the questions in and he can answer them, and that way we're not having this cut off, and I don't think you're getting good use of your time when everything is going like it is. So,
I think I'm getting good use of my time. I appreciate that, Chair.
so give the minister.
I have no
Let the
complaint.
minister finish the answer before you jump on another question, and I'll advise you. Okay. You got the floor, sir.
on the dairy sector, I must say that's also an important discussion we have, because 2 days after, I met with about 30 representatives across country of the SM5, the Supply Managed 5, and we had the discussions about the impact and the next step. I met with them. I met with the chair of the Canadian Dairy Farmer, and just to let you know, he lives about 10 minutes from my own house. So I am as committed as anyone. I represent a rural riding, and I have him about 10 minutes from where I live. I'm
sorry, but will the compensation package come?
Well, what I can say to you is that we decided with the Dairy Farmers of Canada and the other SM5 to first discuss about the impact that the TPP can have, because, you know, with the new configuration, people need to spend time on understanding the impact, and we're discussing next steps.
So maybe.
Your time is pretty well up, but there won't be time for another question, and we're going to have to move over to the Liberals for 5 minutes. Mr. Dhaliwal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Minister, welcome, and thank you to the officials. Minister, you mentioned Canada-China trade agreement, and you were there, Prime Minister was there. Have any progress made since then, and how do you foresee moving forward? Do you see a positive or a negative outcome?
Well, we keep engaging with the Chinese officials with respect to the possible future trade negotiation. So we're still in the exploratory talks. We are engaging at the official level. I've been engaging with counterparts in China as well. Like I said, you know, we want to do that. You know, these agreements will be with us for decades. So it's not about next Monday or next Tuesday or next Friday. It's about the next few decades. So what I was saying in an answering previous question is that it's fairly important for me to start with the right basis. So we're doing that with eyes wide open, understanding that Canadians see the opportunities, but see also challenges, that we do that on our home timetable and in accordance with our values. So we're going to keep engaging, obviously, with our Chinese counterpart, and the discussion is ongoing.
You mentioned about the emerging market. Hindustan, India is another emerging market. Prime Minister is heading there tomorrow or day after tomorrow with the delegation, and you've been there many times. Could you tell us what progress was made? Because Prime Minister Modi was here as well. There were some MOUs signed by the previous government. And can you tell us the progress and the Prime Minister visit to India?
Yeah, I mean, you know, India is probably the country that I've been most often since I became Minister of International Trade. And it's just a reflection of the importance of our relationship. As you know, we have about 1.4 million Canadians of Indian origin. Our bilateral trade is about 8 billion. So I've been saying to my Indian counterpart that I think there's scope for more trade between Canada and India. As you know, pulse is our biggest export, about 30%, more than $1 billion. So we've been engaging. Last time that I was there, I think it was in November, we led the largest trade delegation. We had about 130 people with us. We met 11 ministers in India, both at a federal and state level. So we're going to continue. The relationship is certainly good. We want to see more investment. We want to see more trade. And that's why I think the Prime Minister visit is timely. to build these relationships and making sure that as we diversify, the imperative of diversification is clear to Canadians. As we diversify, India is a very interesting market.
Minister, you mentioned Pulses is a big business going to India, and recently I got many calls from the transport industry and people from West that they are facing issues moving forward. The things have slowed down. Are you making any progress on that front?
Well, it's an issue which is paramount to me, Minister Macaulay of Agriculture, every minister, I think, of this government, and I would think every member of Parliament for that matter, because when 30% of your trade is pulses or canola, we have to make sure, and when I had the joint committee meeting with Minister Prabhu, Minister of Trade of India, I made sure that this was front and center, and if my memory serves me well, we also had a representative of Pulses Canada. I wanted to give them access to the Indian minister to express, that Canada wants to be part of India food security. But on our side, we need predictability and stability for our farmers. And we have been discussing about long-term solutions, but rest assured that this is top of my mind and top of our agenda every time we have the opportunity to engage with civil society, with business leaders, with government leaders in India. We restate how interested we are in our bilateral relationship, but obviously some of these irritants we need to address because they are very meaningful to our farmers in Canada.
Minister, we are studying the CTPPP now, and the human rights issues been raised during those proceedings. Could you tell us this on the specific?
Well, human rights is a key element of our foreign policy and our trade policy. I would say when it comes to our trade policy, one way we're doing that to promote is, for example, to promote gender. Canada is the first G7 nation to have a gender chapter in one of its trade agreements. We were the second country in the world, the first G7. This was our trade agreement with Chile. If you look at the CPTPP, we have a labor chapter and an environment chapter. Which are enforceable. Like I said, I think Canadians, those who are watching us, they want us to have a broad-based trade agenda, but not at the expense of the environment, not at the expense of labor rights. And many places around the world where I've been, I say trade is a march to the top, not a race to the bottom. So every time that Canada is at the table, we're trying to raise standards because you cannot do trade the way we used to do before. Trade needs to benefit everyone. And we need to look at win-win situations, just like we're doing in NAFTA. We're trying to do that in all our trade agreements.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Dhaliwal. And we might have time for another round, and we're going to go right over to the Liberals, starting off. And Ms. Ludwig, you got the floor. How are you feeling? You okay?
I'm great.
You're tough.
I won't be running anytime soon.
From New Brunswick, you got to be tough, eh? Go ahead.
Thank you, and thank you for your help this morning, Minister. It was well beyond the call of duty. I just want to comment that previous witnesses who have attended before the committee have talked about CETA and TPP as being the gold standards for trade agreements. So I wanted to, and thank you for all the work and your team on those agreements. One of the things that we heard recently was, from a witness, was that if we're looking at scaling up our capacity for trade, that perhaps we should focus on the high growth potential sectors and be very targeted. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on targeting trade versus broadly approaching trade amongst our SMEs.
Well, thank you for that question. I mean, a committee member will know that as I took this mandate, what's paramount to me, and I think the Canadian, is trade diversification. We know that more than 70% of our exports are currently going to the United States, but also that the U.S. will always remain our largest trading partner, geography obviously being there and the size of the economy. But at the same time, last year on 21st of September, we opened up the European market to Canadians, a market of more than 500 million people, 3.2 trillion of public procurement. And as we did that, then we looked east because, we understand that Asia Pacific is also one of the growing, we know that the economy is moving in that direction. And we want to position Canada. What I was saying on CPTPP, it's not just a trade agreement. This is about making sure that Canada is front and center to develop the terms of trade in a region with countries like Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, Japan. you want Canada to be there to obviously frame the discussion. You know, for example, under the CPTPP, we'll have an accession clause, which gives basically Canada will need to consent for anyone else to join or for the agreement to be amended. So being front and center, being among the first is giving first mover advantage. We talk about the agricultural sector. But I think to your question, we're also looking south. You know, we have initiative with Pacific Alliance, which is Colombia, Chile, Peru, and Mexico. We're also having discussion with Mercosur, which is Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay. So I think what you're seeing is a diversification agenda, which is allowing small and medium-sized businesses to access these markets. You know, Canada represents, what, 0.5% of the world population and about 2.5% of global trade. So for us, opening up new market is not only ensuring our current prosperity, but the one over decades. You know, when you look at these agreements, and I understand some concerns that have been raised, but you need to look at what's the economy is today and what is the economy is going to be in 5, 10, 20, 30 years from now, and position Canada in a position where we will be part of these large trading bloc.
Thank you. I represent a riding, a coastal riding, and so certainly fish and seafood is an important component to our economy in New Brunswick. Why is it important that we have, as you said, a whole of government approach, a coordinated approach to trade in terms of environment and climate change, fisheries and oceans, or the examples of investments in the Ocean Protections Plan and clean technology? Like, how does all that work together if you're trying to explain that to the average person about building and scaling up trade? Thank you.
Well, certainly, I mean, if you look at the seafood industry, opening up the market, for example, in Europe, where tariffs, which were sometime up to 25%, are going down to zero over time. I think shrimp went from 10% or 9% to zero on the 21st of September. Lobster, which is one of our primary export, is going down over 3 years from about 20%, depending if it's frozen or transformed, to about zero. Same thing when you look at markets like in Japan with the CPTPP. I mean, the reality is that I think the export market, first, you're becoming more competitive. So when I did a tour of Atlantic Canada last summer and parts of Quebec, which are involved in the fisheries, you realize with the transformer and the fishers that this is a game changer for them. Because obviously with tariff going down, you open up new markets and you become more competitive. Certainly that's true in the European market. Now when the CPTPP comes into force, Japan is one of the largest importers of seafood in the world. This is really giving a competitive advantage, because you have to see if you are tariff-free, that obviously makes your product far more attractive for export. But as we do that, quite to your point, I sat down in roundtables with communities there. We need to think about also the infrastructure we need around that, because that implies logistics, that implies investments that will, in our trade corridors. I think Minister Garneau has an initiative about trade corridors, because you're opening up new markets, and obviously you need to work to get your product to market. E-commerce is playing a big part of that. I was with some of the biggest platform, and I think the chair is asking me to leave it there.
Yeah, thank you. And the time is up, and we're going to move over to the Conservatives. Mr. Hoback, you've got the floor.
Well, thank you, Chair, and thank you, Minister and Deputy Minister and staff for being here this morning. First thing is, I was in Tokyo. I met with 3 of our trade commissioners in Tokyo the same week you were there. Got to enjoy the snow. I will say this, those 3 commissioners were impressive. They knew their stuff. We had great discussions on the potential for Canada trading through the Asian trading blocks in Japan, and they're excited, I think, to see that this is signed, because they see lots of opportunity. They really commented on how well the pork producers have done in marketing their pork in Japan and around the Asia Pacific through Japan. So I look forward to seeing beef and other products through TPP. And I think this is where it comes to my question. It's so crucial we get this through the House as quickly as possible. So do you have any idea when this will actually come into the House for us to get it through second reading and get into this committee? And I like to think the committee has done so much study on this topic, both in the previous government, this government, plus the Senate has done so much discussions on this that we can actually, outside of doing some maybe looking at the side agreements that you've added to this, the existing agreement is much the same. If we maybe just added 1 or 2 meetings just for that, put this through the committee and get it out so we can have it actually implemented. So we can be one of the first 6 that actually are done and ratified and are moving forward. So can you give us an idea on the timing? It's very important.
As well, you mentioned beef and pork in Japan, and thank you for that. I think I just want to say I'm having a roundtable with the ambassador of Japan today about trade between Canada and Japan with a number of people to make sure that we benefit from these agreements. As you know, signing is in March. You're quite right that the Senate and the House and many people have studied that agreement. So I think we would be, after we come back from the summer, we should be in a position to bring that.
We won't see it until after the summer? There's no chance we can have it in here this spring?
I would think that, if we are going to be doing that as soon as possible, but I'm just mindful of the timetable. And with your help, I think we can get that to the House as quickly as possible. But at the same time, I want to be realistic in terms of the timetable with signing. And as you know, there's a number of process that needs to take place. But trust me, we are as committed as you are with the official opposition to work through Senate. That's why I appeared in front of the Senate.
I was going to stop that. I'm concerned because the first once 6 countries ratify and other countries move forward, then they do have the ability to approve who comes in and who doesn't come in without us actually being ratified. So there is a situation where somebody could come into the agreement and we say, hey, we better hurry up and ratify this because they're going to make a decision without us.
Well, I would say that, no, that's not exactly the case. So no one could join the CPTPP until the initial member have come to the ratification. The accession clause would not allow other countries to come until the agreement would come into force. And you would need the consent of all the signatory of the agreement in order to amend the terms of the agreement or to approve any new members.
6 members.
The signatory would be the 11. Because the 11 will be signing in March and ratification needs 6. Right. So we are protected at the time of signing.
We did allow market access for dairy still in this agreement, even though the U.S. is out of it. We haven't discussed or publicly discussed what that compensation for the dairy producers is going to be. So there was a pre-established compensation figure when we were in government because of that market access. So that access hasn't changed. So even though it's the Americans not shipping milk or dairy products, New Zealand will love to get into this market. So can you tell me, first of all, who's in charge of negotiating the compensation with dairy? Is it yourself or the Minister of Agriculture, or with Supply Management, I should say? And when will those terms be released in public so we can see exactly what they're going to be compensated with?
So what I've been doing with the dairy sector in conjunction with Minister McCauley of Agriculture is to meet with them in order to understand first the impact. I mean, rightly so, you said the U.S. is not there. Quotas have been increasing. There were numbers in the original agreement, but production has also increased. So what we're doing now, and you may have seen they were in here this week. I met, I think, with the president last week again. We are in ongoing discussion with them about first understanding the impact on the sector, and secondly about next steps. But we're still very much in meeting with our officials and their officials, I would say, to try to understand the impact. Like you said, rightly so, whether you can ship fresh products, there's discussions around, that. But I would say that I'm very pleased to see that we are working diligently with them.
Sorry, I don't mean to catch off. Just he's very tight in time.
You got half a minute.
One
so
last
quick question, quick answer,
you talked
Minister.
about in your speech about using the TPP to set the rules for trade in Asia. Now, as we talk about the best way to go about doing an agreement with China, I know my beef producers, grain producers, they want to see trade increase with China, but they want good enforceable rules. Do you not think it'd be better to get a good enforceable trade agreement using TPP as the platform rather than doing it bilateral on our own where it's tough to enforce the rules of non-tariff trade barriers?
The only thing I can say to that is that a number of countries have expressed a desire to join the CPTPP. You may have heard Korea. I've even heard about the UK wanting to join the CPTPP. So I think that the negotiation or discussion we have with China is on a separate track. We want to get, obviously, to signing and ratification of the CPTPP. But what I can tell you is that we have a broad-based agenda when it comes to this region, but I think for the time being, my understanding and the discussions that have been going on with the trade minister in the CPTPP, people are trying to, let's get to signature, let's get to ratification, and then let's look at what other country could join, because like I said, a number of them have already publicly expressed a potential desire to join that grouping. But
no, Mr. Hoback, we'll have to, sorry, Mr. Well, you're 6 minutes now.
Usually at the end I would remind you, Chair. So.
Okay, we're going to move over to Liberals. And Mr. Peterson, you're starting off.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci, le ministre, d'être ici.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Minister, for being here this morning. Thank you very much. I have a few questions. My first question.
As you know, across Canada, there was a lot of support for it. Some concerns, a lot of the concerns related around two issues, I think. It was the IP and ISDS. And it seems to me both of those provisions are improved in CPTPP. Can you elaborate on those improvements and how that, I think, makes this a better deal?
Well, thank you very much. I mean, this is one of the things I wish I could have answered to Ms. Ramsey before in terms of the IP was one of the crucial things I think we've achieved for Canada. As you know, the innovators and entrepreneurs were really concerned by the terms that were in the original text of the TPP. You may have seen the op-ed from Jim Basile. What we were successful, and I think this is very much a Canadian initiative, was to suspend a number of provisions of the 22 which relate to IP, namely in copyright extension. There was patent extension as well, which is giving a better outcome, certainly for all the entrepreneur innovators across Canada. And I think this is very much thanks to Canada that we pushed the envelope and got a much better deal for our industry. The other thing you mentioned, ISDS, that's the same thing. We were able to push back and seek suspension to make sure that we could regulate in Canada's best interest, obviously, but also that ISDS would not be applying to certain decision-taking under the Invest Canada Act, protecting our ability to enforce this act the way we deem fit for Canada. So I think at the same time we struck the right balance, protecting our investors who want to be in these markets, but at the same time protecting our own right to regulate in the best interest of Canadians. So I think this is a two significant achievement. I think the market access in the auto sector is one significant as well. I would just use that to say, to complement the answer I gave to Ms. Ramsey, that for the first time in Japan history, my understanding is that they have given the largest market access. They have provided Canada, through a side letter, an enforceable mechanism. And not only they did that, is that we want that to be evergreen so that we have a most favored nation clause in it. That means that if Japan was ever to give preferential market access on better terms to any country, namely the United States or Europe, that would apply automatically to Canada. So that's an evergreen that we wanted to make sure that we would always be in the best possible position. But certainly on IP and ISDS, I think we've achieved great things for Canadians.
Thank you for that. Mr. Chair, I'm going to share my time with Mr. Fonseca so he can get the question.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson, Mr. Chair. And Minister, thank you very much. Minister, I had the opportunity, the pleasure to be with you last week at the TSX. I'm going to bring us a little bit from Asia over to South America. We had the opportunity there to meet with stakeholders. You spoke, you presented. Those stakeholders were talking about the Mercosur countries and also the Pacific Alliance and the opportunities that we have there. We had mining, infrastructure, financial services, etc. What are you looking for to formalize an agreement with the Pacific Alliance and looking at also the Mercosur countries?
Yeah, you're right. Last week we had a roundtable. I would include, we had people from the auto sector quite significantly in the room as well to look at the opportunities for the sector in opening up markets. As the Pacific Alliance, as members would know, Canada was asked to join or to become a member state, associate member status, sorry. And this we achieve along with New Zealand, Singapore, and Australia, which is basically uplifting the position of Canada when it comes to the Pacific Alliance. Although we have free trade agreements with each and every country, this is about, again, removing non-tariff trade barriers and engaging with these countries further. When it comes to Mercosur, the interesting thing is that governments in Argentina and Brazil, and those are huge economy, obviously, and Paraguay and Uruguay, I've been asking Canada to restart these discussions. So what we're doing, which I think is the proper step, like I said, Canada is not rushing into anything. Despite that my colleagues have been eager for Canada to engage, I said the first thing we need to do is to talk to stakeholders. And we want to engage with stakeholders to understand the benefits, and if there are some, concerns, to address them upfront. So we can take all that into consideration. So what we did at the TSX last week and what we'll be doing is obviously engaging with stakeholders to understand whether and how this would be in their best interest. And on the basis of the positive feedback, I must say we received almost unanimously at the table, understanding that there are some concerns about non-tariff trade barriers, but people saw that this agreement should be a mechanism to remove them and facilitate trade and mobility to allow, obviously, people to sell, for example, services and goods in very big markets in South America.
Thank you, Mr. Fonseca. Looks like we've got time for 2 more MPs, if it's okay with the Minister.
Yes, sir, Chair, I was late, so I'm quite happy to stay.
Okay, we're going to go to Conservatives now. Mr. Kerry, you got the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And Minister, thank you for being here. And one of the things you said, the most important issue with these agreements is these non-tariff barriers. And I think I agree with you. Many people agree with you. You also mentioned that you're not rushing into anything, and I'm going to push back on you on that a little bit. As you know, the Senate is now doing their hearings on the marijuana legalization, and we're finding major issues with it domestically. In other words, the science isn't there. How do we determine impairment? As you know, there's 3 international treaties that Canada has signed on to, and Canada's signature means something. At least it has meant something. Where we agreed to ban marijuana, and now Canada will be withdrawing. And I think the responsible, proactive thing, if you weren't rushing, would have been to give notice that we would be withdrawing from these treaties. So we've had Canadian companies in front of this committee that are concerned that how you have not managed the marijuana file could become a non-tariff barrier for these companies, particularly with our major trading partners that have issues with marijuana being illegal. I'm talking about the United States, Mexico, you mentioned Japan and China. And basically, what I'm going to ask you today is put on the record, what is your government's plan? And have you updated our major trading partners on your plan to manage the marijuana file? And can you guarantee Canadian companies that this is not going to be a non-tariff barrier that's going to thicken the border?
Well, thank you for the question. It's an important question. I'm sure that the member would appreciate that this would be best addressed by my colleague, Minister Freeland of Foreign Affairs, who has a responsibility with treaty obligations. But what I can say is that we are engaging broadly in our diversification agenda. You were mentioning about non-tariff trade barrier. This is something that I must say to this committee that I take very seriously. As you said, tariffs are going down. I've been engaging also with stakeholders about not only non-tariff trade barriers, but for example, the role of data in future trade agreements to make sure that, data is properly addressed in trade agreements. We understand that data is probably going to be one of the most
Excuse me, Minister,
precious.
we're not talking about data. I understand Minister Freeland might be the best person to discuss this, but we are the International Trade Committee here. Obviously, I would assume that she has updated you and kept you briefed. So maybe you could just explain that, have you brought this up with any of our major trading partners? Maybe a specific example, we've had Canadians stopped at the American border just by admitting that they've used marijuana in the past, they've been turned back. So we have literally, I think you know the numbers, it's like $750 billion a day per year going across that border, which is significant. And to not address this issue would be seen as very irresponsible. So how about a specific question, inadvertent exposure? If Canadians are inadvertently exposed to marijuana or through edibles, which your government is planning to legalize soon as well, is there going to be random testing at the American border? Have you brought any of these issues up with the United States, our major trading partner?
Well, as the member would certainly appreciate, all these issues have been considered. There's many ministers which have been involved, the Minister of Public Safety, for example, Minister Freeland. We are engaging with stakeholders. We are making sure that Canada's position is well understood, not only domestically but internationally. But what I can say when it comes to international trade is that we are eager to deal with any and all irritants that comes to our attention. That's why I created recently this task force to make sure that non-tariff trade barriers would be notified, would be addressed, and that we can respond properly. And with the help of the member, if there are any other trade irritants that you see, if you bring them to our attention, we'll make sure that we investigate them under our trade agreements.
Sir, I am bringing it to your attention. We've had Canadian companies here who are concerned about it. We don't see a plan from your government, and from your statements, I think I can clarify that you don't have a plan. You haven't addressed it with our major trading partners. There is no certainty out there that this will not become a non-tariff barrier, which you stated at the onset that this is the most important thing that you have to deal with. So very disappointing to hear that, but hopefully there's less than 5 months, Minister, before your own deadline. Hopefully you pay attention to what the Senate is doing and see if you can address this proactively, not rush into it for Canadian companies. Quick question, rules of origin. It seems CPTPP and NAFTA are going in different directions. Could you kind of consolidate that? I believe the North American Free Trade Agreement, Mr. Trump wants to raise North American content. The TPP appears...
Mr. Kerry, your time is up, but if the minister has a very quick answer, your time is up, but a quick answer.
Well, I'd be happy, and I would say with respect, we do have a plan, Chair. I was trying to bring the question and the comments of the member in the context of international trade and telling him that we are looking at all non-tariff trade barriers and that the Minister of Foreign Affairs, as well as a number of members of Cabinet, have been addressing and considering the questions that he raised, and that we do have a plan. With respect to international trade and the rules of origin, you don't need to take it from me, but you can take it from our chief negotiator, Steve Verrou, which has said that with respect to rules of origin, the CPTPP and NAFTA on separate tracks. And the discussion I had with representative of the industry, they understand very well that in order to sell in the North American market, they'll have to meet the threshold that will be established under NAFTA, and that we are working together. People understand that they are very much engaged. We have consultation, as you would expect, with the industry throughout the negotiation, and we have been quite clear that those are separate tracks, and that that's why it was so important in CPTPP to make sure that we have bilateral letters, side letters with Australia and Malaysia in order to get market access, because we know that with Canadian content alone, you cannot meet the 45% threshold. So therefore, we needed to make sure that we had bilateral letters with Malaysia and Australia in order to be able to sell Canadian vehicles in these markets.
Thank you, Minister. And we're going to wrap up with the NDP. Mr. Ramsey, you got 3 minutes.
In light of a large portion of the debate and speeches yesterday that were given around the rights of Indigenous people to self-determination, I'd like to ask in the TPP specifically if Indigenous people have given free, informed, and prior consent to sign the TPP.
Well, what I can say, and I was pleased to see in the report that there have been representatives of First Nations which have you've consulted or have given testimony, and I think this is an important part as an open and transparent government. We're always looking at engaging with First Nations to make sure that these trade agreements would obviously serve them as well as serve every other Canadians in the nation.
So that's different than them giving that free, informed, and prior consent. Consultation is quite different than that. So in a true nation-to-nation relationship with self-determination of Indigenous people, have you received their free, informed, and prior consent to sign the TPP?
Well, what I can say, Mr. Chair, is that we, throughout the committee, I think you've had hearing for more than a year, and throughout the 40,000 or 50,000...
Clearly from Indigenous people that they were not happy with the deal and that they would see a charter challenge in it. So I just have to ask again, have you received that from Indigenous people?
Mr. Chair, I'm happy to answer, but if I have a chance to answer...
Go ahead, sir.
Yes or no?
No. You want me to answer, Chair?
Yeah, sir.
Just to listen to the
make
question?
an answer. Yeah, go ahead, sir. You got the floor.
So what I was saying is that, through the 40 or 50,000 interaction or feedback we receive from Canadians, we have consulted widely. We are committed, obviously, to the First Nation. The Prime Minister yesterday made it very clear. And I understand that this committee as well has been hearing, and I read it in the report just yesterday, that they had an opportunity, to, obviously, to give us feedback. And we will continue to engage, because that's an important part of our Canadians, and we want to make sure that these trade agreements work for everyone. And that actually you can ask even the First Nations that I've been talking to them about potentially having a First Nation trade mission in the world, engaging with them to make sure that they would get access to these markets and that we could open new markets for them.
Okay, I'll have to take that as a no. So the question that I have for you now is about a Global Affairs Canada Commission study that was conducted by the Centre for the Study of Living Standards, and they came up with a really startling number about trade with China. It found that trade with China was responsible for the loss of 105,000 manufacturing jobs in Canada between 2001 and 2011. Is this a concern to your department?
Well, I'm sure Ms. Ramsey would be happy, Mr. Chair, that we're not rushing into anything when it comes to China. that we are taking our time. As I said, we're doing that with eyes wide open. We're consulting with nations who already have free trade agreements with China, understanding that when tariff may come down, what are the non-tariff trade barriers? Some members mentioned state-owned enterprises. We have the best team on the ground, making sure that we understand all that. And that's why, Mr. Chair, we did not rush when we were last time in Beijing. There was some reports about that, and we say, no, we want to make sure that we start on strong footing, that both sides understand what we want to discuss. Progressive elements are important. We're going to do it on our timetable and certainly in line with Canadian values.
Thank you, and that wraps up the time. And go ahead.
Intercede just for a minute. The minister did say he did have a plan addressing marijuana, that the government has a plan for that. And I was just wondering if he could provide it to committee, because there's less than 5 months, and Canadian business needs certainty.
I think the minister and his staff heard the question, and we'll leave
sure
it.
that
We'll leave it at
members
that.
will see that Canada has a plan to deal with marijuana.
We'll leave it with that. And very active meeting here this morning. Thank you very much for coming, Minister.
Thank you very much,
always
Chair.
make time to come here, and let's keep her going. We're just going to suspend for a couple of minutes because we're going to go in camera.